So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webcast, Advancing Equity Through Literacy in Egypt and South Sudan. To begin, I would like to introduce who our presenters are today for the webcast. So we have Yasmin Adel, who is an education program manager with Save the Children in Egypt in our country office. Yasmin has 10 years of experience supporting development and humanitarian programs, and she specializes in empowering marginalized groups, such as women, youth, refugees, and small farmers. Yasmin really enjoys mentoring local program staff and developing and maintaining collaborative working relationships with others, such as donors and various stakeholders. Currently, she is managing projects that support Syrian and African refugees and migrants. We also have Dr. Nikit Dasa, who is the Director of Research, Evaluation, and Learning at Save the Children in Washington, D.C. Dr. Dasa is a developmental psychologist with experience as a technical advisor and applied researcher on education and child protection programs in both development and humanitarian contexts. He has expertise in designing and managing cross-sectoral learning frameworks, leading summative impact evaluations, conducting formative, qualitative, and mixed method research, and designing appropriate measures and surveys, all while working with practitioners to make evidence-based changes in our program interventions. We also have Julia Finder-Jonah, which is me. I'm an Education and Emergencies Advisor with Save the Children in Washington. Julia Finder-Jonah is an education specialist with over 10 years of experience working domestically and internationally in the field of education. She currently is an Education and Emergencies Advisor in the Department of Education and Child Protection, and in this role, she provides technical support to projects in the Middle East and East and West Africa. She contributes to strategy formation, proposal development, and the creation of practical tools and resources related to non-formal education and social emotional learning. And Wendy Wheaton from USAID unexpectedly shared with us this morning that she is unfortunately unable to join the webcast, but we're going to carry on without her, and hopefully we can still address some questions you may have about South Sudan. We will begin by giving a brief overview of the Learning and Wellbeing in Emergencies program that Save the Children has developed. We will then move into looking at how this program was used in a pilot in Egypt. From there, we will move to looking at evidence from the pilot that was done of this program in South Sudan, so having a bit of a comparison between the two different locations. Then we will move on to any questions that you may have throughout the presentation, and then finally conclude by telling you a little bit more about some of the work the Education Equity Initiative is doing and the Equity Task Team through ECCN to link all of this work back to equity, which is kind of the focus of this webcast for us. So to begin, we will start by looking at the program Save the Children developed called Learning and Wellbeing in Emergencies. And the goal of this is how we've been able to advance equity through literacy, through this program in both Egypt and South Sudan. So we designed the Learning and Wellbeing in Emergencies program when thinking about how is it that we can effectively contribute to increasing equity. And so there were a few questions that we needed to consider and that we wanted to explore. We were thinking about how to achieve greater equitable outcomes in our program. And so thinking about, what are the various barriers that exist that prevent children from achieving equitable learning outcomes? So we thought about, what impacts access to education? What factors influence the quality of education that is provided to children? And then what also contributes to varying educational outcomes? So some of the guiding principles that informed our design were these three specific questions. Why are learning and well-being important during an emergency? what keeps a child from learning in an emergency, and who needs to be involved in whatever the program design will look like so that we can make sure we're supporting children to achieve learning outcomes. So our Learning and Wellbeing in Emergencies program is designed based on this ecological framework. So we all know that in emergencies, students' cognitive, emotional, and social development, as well as their physical well-being, are often negatively impacted. And we know that this often leads to children becoming more vulnerable in these contexts. So we also know that it's very important for each member of the community, such as teachers, parents and caregivers, and community members, to play a certain role, and that also each of these different groups requires support since they've all been affected in some way by the crisis, by the situation. And so through designing our program, we thought about the role that each of these different groups needs to play to support children. So we've prioritized thinking about, how can we help these various groups to support self-care, to practice stress management that they can do both themselves and with children, and also how are we going to build their social and emotional knowledge about attitudes and skills that will help them strengthen their own well-being and the well-being of others. And we also realized that through this process, we had the chance to improve quality teaching and learning processes and contribute to overall greater emotionally supportive families and community environments. And so I've been talking a little bit about what went into the design of our Learning and Wellbeing in Emergencies program, but you may be wondering what it actually is. So some of you may be familiar with Save the Children's early grade reading program called Literacy Boost. And our Learning and Wellbeing in Emergencies program is an adaptation of Literacy Boost specifically designed for emergency contexts. So some of the biggest differences between the two programs, LWiE, as we call it, for Learning, Wellbeing, and Emergencies, has a very flexible design, and it can be implemented quickly within the first phase of a crisis. It also focuses on 3 areas. So we address literacy skills, reading comprehension, as well as social emotional learning, both for teachers and for students. And within the training that we provide for teachers on social emotional learning, there are 3 core areas that we focus on. Self-care, so how teachers are able to address their own well-being needs and support their own increased well-being, what they need to look for in students so that they're able to support students' increased well-being. We also talk about stress management techniques and also strategies for coping with crisis. So the 3 pillars that have gone into our design of the Learning and Wellbeing in Emergencies program do all focus on learning, but learning in a way that we're addressing the holistic overview and the support at various levels. So within community action, we all know that community plays a really important role in supporting children's academic and emotional development. So one thing that we've done in this program is forming reading clubs for students who are struggling to achieve learning outcomes. And by engaging community in both supporting literacy development as well as emotional development, we've been able to see some positive outcomes that my colleagues will talk about a little bit later as we get into some of the results of the pilot. There's also a component of teacher training. We know that training is very helpful for teachers and it's needed, but we also know that ongoing professional development support can help make a very positive impact. And so we've designed training and follow-up for teachers to produce higher quality and equitable student outcomes. And so part of that is by teaching them how to incorporate reading skills and literacy skills that also link with social emotional learning strategies into their regular daily lessons and into the curriculum. And then finally, assessment. We know this is a really important part of the teaching and learning process. And so with our assessment, we're trying to help teachers learn how to better tailor their lessons so that they can meet all children's needs. And we're using these assessments to really inform teachers about what children's strengths are, what their weaknesses are, so that we can make sure that all children have the opportunity to achieve great learning outcomes. So we know that being aware of the context is critical for achieving positive results during program implementation. And we also know that it is critical to understand the link between well-being and school safety, and also linking to existing systems and longer-term goals. And also when thinking about how we're going to monitor our project, right? What adaptive interventions can we put forth? Thinking about all of this is very critical. And all of these different aspects of program design and implementation went into constructing our theory of change. So the theory of change for this program does again look at the three different pillars. So thinking about the role that teachers play, the role that community plays, and how we're going to assess and monitor the impact of the program. But it's based on the premise that if teachers and community members are equipped with the requisite skills and knowledge to support children's well-being and learning, and if children are supported in school settings that promote their well-being and provide access to quality education, then children are equipped with the requisite support and skills to be able to access and benefit from safe and protective learning spaces and equality education during crisis. And so, as you can see from that theory of change, contextualization is extremely important. And there's several reasons why. So when we are rolling out this program, we do need to go through a process of contextualization. So some things that we look at are the different layers. So again, going back to kind of the holistic framework, what will the community do? What will, thinking about national levels as well, especially within education, right? We oftentimes have local officials and then state officials and then national officials, and what systems are already in place that we need to work within. And then also thinking about how we will respond, right? The response in each community does depend on the context and the needs of each community. We also need to think about the time frame. So where are we within the conflict cycle or the crisis cycle, and make sure that we're adapting our approach to rolling out this program based on where we are. Are we in the first phase of an emergency, or are we much later in a protracted crisis, possibly looking towards early recovery when thinking about the nexus between humanitarian and development programming? And then we also need to consider aspects that we know affect learning outcomes. So what language of instruction is being used? How are we presenting certain concepts? Are they being presented in a way that aligns with the local culture? And through this contextualization process of this program, we have found some positive byproducts which have led to a sense of ownership within the community. And therefore, the desire to sort of take this on, the acknowledgement that supporting well-being is critical, especially when trying to bridge some of those learning outcome gaps that certain marginalized populations may experience, to try to create more equitable learning outcomes across the board. So getting that buy-in and that support from the community has been really important. So this has given you kind of a general overview of the program, how it was designed, a little bit about the process of how we roll it out in country, and I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague to tell you specifics from one of our pilots.
Thank you, Julia. So I will take you now to a quick presentation on the implementation itself for this program. So as we pilot this program in 2017 in Egypt, and we implemented this program with refugees and migrants in Egypt. So I will go through a quick fact sheet published from UNHCR by end of August, showing you the numbers and the population of the refugees and migrants here in Egypt. So as per August, we have 235,000 of registered refugees and asylum seekers in Egypt. And you can see that Syrians have the highest percentage here in Egypt, 56%. And then we have Sudanese, we have Ethiopian, Eritrean, South Sudanese, Somali, Yemenis, and others. And you can also see that we have 48% female and 52 male, and the age group and the percentage for each age group. That before we started in our implementation, we used to study the education context here in Egypt for the refugees and migrants. So we found that we have three types of education service that the refugees and migrants took in Egypt. The first one is the community learning centers, which is managed and established by the refugee community themselves. So we have more than 170 centers all over Egypt, which are not registered under Ministry of Education. It's like a private learning centers that includes different nationalities: Syrian, Sudanese, South Sudanese, Eritrean, Somali, and Ethiopian. To let you know a quick overview on this community center, that when the refugees came in the beginning, they found a lot of challenges in the public governmental schools, so they preferred to set their own learning centers. However, it's not informal centers, so they prefer to set the centers to take the education service, and then they can go and set their exams in any other channel. So, for example, for the Syrians, all of them registered in the governmental schools, and they study the Egyptian curriculum, and they set their exams in the Egyptian schools, but they go and attend all day education activities in the community learning centers. So they like registered in two different forms of education. For Sudanese and Eritrean and all other African nationalities, they have no access to register in the governmental schools, so they have their own community centers, and they study there, and then they have the right to go to the Sudanese embassy and set their exams there and pay like $100 or $200. So this is the first type, the informal community learning centers. And then we have the Egyptian public schools under Ministry of Education. And the Syrian children who are enrolled in the Egyptian public schools, I mean here that they are enrolled and attended the full academic year in the Egyptian public schools, and they are not attending the community learning centers. And also the African and asylum seeker have no access to register in this public schools. Then we have the third part, the dropouts, the refugees' children who prefer to drop out either for learning or stay at home, or they couldn't afford the education fees, the education service fees. So these are the three types of education that the refugees and migrants have in Egypt. So when we started our program, I will follow up on what Julia said. We have three pillars: the teacher training, the parent sessions, and the school book banks and reading clubs. For the teachers training, the program includes 10 sessions for the teachers training, targeting social emotional learning and literacy technical skills and materials development. So mainly the social emotional learning is to try to give the teachers the techniques that they can use for to control their stress, and to have a self care, and to know more about the social emotional skills for their children and also themselves. Also, we try to uh, teach the teachers how it's important to take care of the social, emotional, and learning and the well-being of the children, as it affects their learning outcomes, and it responded to another challenges the children had in their life. Then we have the literacy skills, the 6 sessions for the literacy skills, which mainly talked about two sectors: the listening skills, the listening literacy skills, and the reading comprehension. So letter identification, as we have in the Arabic language, different shapes for the letter, if it came in the first of the word or in the middle of the word or by end of the word. So it's all related to the technicalities of the literacy skills. Then, after that, we have one session on the material development and what they need to take care when they develop a material, especially for the children who pass through a crisis or in emergency context, and how to design a material that have inclusion approach and gender sensitive approach and equality as well. This for the teachers. Then we came for the parents, as we need to work with all the sectors that affect the child. So as we use the child-centered approach, we used to work with the parents as well. Also, the sessions for the parents, they are 22 sessions for the parents. So they are talked about social emotional learning and giving them strategies for promoting learning at home. And surprisingly, we found it a great response from the parents, as many of them said that our children passed by a very hard situation, and we need someone to teach us how to take care of their social emotional learning and their well-being, and how to help them and to promote learning techniques at home that we can help. But also, one of the findings that came out from this sessions with parents, that we found that the parents themselves need a specialized program for their well-being and their social emotional learning. And also, we found some of the African parents who couldn't read and write. So we used to implement some literacy program with them as well, in order to empower them to help their children at home. Then, for the most important part, and we use the teachers and the parents in it, which is the reading clubs. And this part, we implement actually the program with the children on the field. So we provided the school with school book bank that includes books related to the literacy and very simple stories and drawing books, includes simple letters to enhance the children reading and writing skills. And also, we implement a specialized social emotional learning program with the children through the trained teachers. This program includes set of activities that targeting the five competences of the social emotional learning, which are related to how to take a decision, self-assessment, the relationship between the child and the others, and we mainstream the equity and gender and the inclusive approaches across this program. So we found that in one of the schools, for example, African school, we found that parents used to send their boys to the school, and they used to keep the daughters in home. So when we worked with the parents, they said that we don't know in the past that our daughter can do something, or we think only that the education is important for boys. And other example, I remember it myself, that I found one girl told me that why I should learn and study now in the primary stage, as when I know that when I finish my primary stage and start to go to the preparatory and high school, my parents will keep me at home and they will force me to move for early marriage or something like that. So when you work with parents and teachers, you change their mindset about the importance of the education service and the well-being of the children, and how it will affect their whole life for to enroll in the education service. Also, we found that the teachers themselves are used to split the children according to their gender. So they used to do some activities for boys, but they used to keep the girls at the classroom. They said, no, it's not appropriate for the girls. And also for the children with special needs, they used to ignore the children with special needs according to their type of need. But generally, they are not recognized them in their activities. So this program gives them, or the activities of the social emotional learning, give them the opportunity to design special activities for those children, and not only special activities, how to enroll them and how to empower them to participate in all the classroom activities. So this was for the program implementation itself inside the African and Syrian community learning centers. Then we worked with this program with the Ministry of Education itself because we need to this program to be implemented on a national level, to scale up this program to be implemented in the Egyptian governmental school. So the first step that we introduced this program for Ministry of Education at a central level, and then we found a great response from the ministry officials. They said that we have a psychological issue in our schools. We have some discrimination and inequality issues and trends also in our school, and also we have a low reading and writing level for our children because many challenges in the education system, such as the performance of teachers inside the classroom, the crowded classroom. There is no space for all the children, lack of resources inside the school, the infrastructure is not very appropriate for the education service. So actually we found a great response from the ministry to use this program. Then we revised and adapt the training program and the manuals and the stories and the activities to the Egyptian schools context. So if one of the activities is not appropriate for the classroom setup, so we revisit this activity and we try to adapt it according to the public education system. Then we passed by the accreditation process, which used to be done by Ministry of Education itself. And fortunately, and we were very happy to have this manual accredited, and we reached an agreement with Ministry of Education that they will implement this program on the national level. And this year we will start with the teachers training on this manual in order to create a cadre of master trainers for LWiE to implement it in the next period with all the schools. Also, I need to highlight one important thing here, that from our assessment with Ministry of Education, we found that there is a lot of inequality between the different nationalities in the school. So if we have Syrians and Egyptians, the children and the parents and the teachers used to discriminate between nationalities. So maybe they can ignore the Syrian refugees, maybe they can treat them in another way, or they said that stay at home and I will let you succeed in the exam, something like that. And also we found a discrimination or unfair treatment between girls and boys. So they used to have boys in the first lines in the classroom and girls in the back. And also for the activities, they used to let the boys go to the sports activity, but for the girls, they kept them at the class. So I hopefully this program will touch this inequality issues and gender-based violence issues inside. So as I mentioned, the great response from the Ministry of Education due to the equality issues and psychological and literacy issues. Uh, this was an overview on the program, and I will hand now to my colleague, Dr. Nakat, to go through South Sudan experience.
Thank you, Yasmin. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk specifically about the research that we did on the Learning and Wellbeing in Emergencies project in South Sudan. And so the project itself, Learning and Wellbeing in Emergencies, the pilot was in two countries, in both Egypt, which Yasmin has talked about, and in South Sudan as well. And so in our grand planning, I was supposed to be the bridge between Yasmin's presentation in Egypt and talking about South Sudan, and then having Wendy bring in some more experience around the equity issues in South Sudan. But since Wendy can't be here, I'll talk a little bit about that as well. one of the things to remember is that we did this program. It started in about the middle of 2016 and went till about the end of 2017. And so when we first started this program in South Sudan, in July of 2016 was when we saw the uptick of violence and clashes in Juba, which had a ripple effect on conflict throughout the country. And so we had initially planned to do a much more robust, rigorous evaluation and look at the proof of concept of learning and well-being in emergencies in South Sudan. But because of the disruptions to the system, because of the conflict and the civil unrest in South Sudan through 2016 and into 2017, our teams had a really hard time tracking down children. So one of the issues that we faced was that there was a lot of movement between the camps that we were working in. So by the end of 2017, there were about 1.8 million South Sudanese refugees in the region, so in Uganda and in the countries surrounding South Sudan. But within South Sudan itself, there were about 1.9 million internally displaced South Sudanese. And the project that we focused on were for Sudanese refugees in northern South Sudan, so in the Maban region, where we have about 140,000, or we had about 140,000 Sudanese refugees from the Blue Nile region of Sudan. And these refugees settled in 4 main camps. So we had Doro, Batil, Gendrasa, and Kaya. And about 55,000 of those were in Doro. And so this project was focused in Doro on refugees from Sudan into South Sudan. About 45% of the refugees in the Doro camp are children, and most of them were either out of school or had never been to school or had very limited educational or academic background. And they'd also witnessed a lot of violence and conflict. And so the program itself was meant to really help children in terms of their literacy skills, but also, as Julia and both Yasmin have talked about, support the well-being of these children, both through a directed activity-based curriculum for children around social emotional skills, but also focusing on parents and teachers and kind of the ecological system around the children. And so because we couldn't do a large impact evaluation and actually look at the effect over a period of time because of the movement and the migration and the constant disruptions in the camp, the team in South Sudan came to me and asked, can we even measure anything in this context? And so we wanted to figure out, in this context, in Doro, in Maban, in South Sudan, how effectively and how feasibly could the team measure outcomes around social emotional learning and literacy for children? And can we see that kind of, or measure that kind of growth over a period of a year with children moving from grade 3 into grade 4? And so we focused on a small pilot in 4 schools following 100 children randomly selected from those 4 schools from grade 3 into grade 4. And we focused on 2 different outcomes: social emotional learning, as Julia has talked about, which is primarily the interpersonal and intrapersonal skills that children and all of us really need to be able to manage our emotions, to recognize and manage our own emotions, to recognize emotions and feelings in other people, be empathetic about to take that perspective, and manage our social relationships with others. And from a lot of research, primarily in high-income countries, we've seen a strong relationship between these social emotional skills and academic outcomes, especially for children who've experienced severe adversity or adverse childhood experiences. And so at Save the Children, since early 2015, we've been developing a measure, an assessment to help us better understand the social emotional learning skills of children. And we call it the International Social Emotional Learning Assessment, or ISELA for short. And this assessment is specifically, we designed it to be open source for us to use, as well as other partners in the sector to use, for it to be as feasible as possible to be used in the field and to be field-facing in terms of the outcomes and the information it generated, so it could actually be used by teams in the field to understand programs and adapt programs based on it. And it measures the social emotional learning skills for children between the ages of about 6 to 12, so in the early grades moving into the end of primary school. And it measures 6 main areas of skills. So one is self-concept, which is a child's ability to identify or appropriately identify themselves, their strengths, their weaknesses. And in this tool, we specifically look at future orientation, which is the child able to imagine a positive future for themselves and identify accurately things that could get them there or stop them from getting there. We also look at coping mechanisms or stress management skills, which are culturally appropriate ways for children to manage stressful situations. Third, we look at perseverance, so the goal-setting behaviors of children, but also their ability to persevere when given increasingly complex performance-based tasks. So we give children increasingly complex things to draw and see and actually measure their perseverance over those tasks. We also look at empathy or perspective taking, which is trying to understand if children can actually take the perspective of another child, identify an emotion in another child, and accurately figure out things that they could do to support that other child. So take the perspective of the other child, but also think what would be useful for that other child. We also look at antisocial and prosocial behavior. So these are the conduct problems that children might exhibit in the classroom or in school or in their homes, as well as prosocial behaviors or socially appropriate behaviors that children may exhibit in their communities. And finally, we look at the network of the child, the social network of the child. Because learning and well-being in emergencies is focused not just on the child, but on the ecological system, we also wanted to understand what are the relationships that the child has and how do those actually figure in terms of the support system that the child has. We also looked in South Sudan at literacy. We used an adapted version of the literacy boost assessment. So we had a letter grid of about 20 different letters, but we also gave children a short reading passage at a grade 3 level and looked at the accuracy of their reading, the number of words they could read correctly per minute, as well as their reading comprehension skills. And one thing I'd like to mention at this point is, so we looked at all of these outcomes, but because this was a really small sample, we didn't really have as much information to look at the core equity domains that we would like to. So we did collect information on gender, on age, on the socioeconomic status or wealth possessions in the household, and we didn't really find many differences between children on those. And in the growth in these skills across those domains. And primarily, it's probably because we didn't really have a sample size that was large enough for us to be able to capture those differences. However, we did see marked improvements in several of the domains. So in the assessment in South Sudan, we didn't include any of the stress management items, but across the other 5 skill domains, we actually saw improvements that were statistically, but also practically meaningful for us in terms of self-concept, empathy, perseverance, and social support. The one area where we didn't really see many strong improvements was in the antisocial and prosocial behavior. And that was also an issue with the functioning of those items that we've started to work with a little bit more. And so this brings us to the discussion around equity within this ICELA tool. So we have what we could consider more generic domains of equity, like gender, age, socioeconomic status, but we also look at more dynamic perspectives of equity within this tool. So one of the things that we look at is the social support system. And we think this is really important because given our work in Literacy Boost, in Numeracy Boost, in our work with youth in continental Africa, we understand the importance of the social system in helping children and adolescents build skills and use those skills. And so we really think of the social support system as an equity factor. Children that have more support, more resources in terms of that support are likely able to develop skills a lot faster and a lot stronger than other children. And so we want to be able to capture that equity and figure out whether our programs like Learning and Wellbeing in Emergencies that is meant to target the social network of the child actually does that. And so what we found in South Sudan is that the average child had a network of about 8 to 10 people, about 4 to 5 family members, about 3 close friends, and about 1 to 2 community members, like a teacher or a school counselor or a community mobilizer that they went to or they talked to. And what we found was that when children were sad or upset, the amount or the number of people that they could go to in their social network over a year from grade 3 to grade 4 didn't really increase dramatically. But when it came to sharing feelings or going to someone when needing help with issues, we saw that most children, or the average child, reported that they were able to go to one additional person. So we see that as a practically meaningful thing, that there's an additional person for the child to be able to go to when they need that support, which is important in the context of disruption, where children might need multiple dimensions of support when they have an issue or a problem. The other dimension of equity that we also looked at was the environment around the child. A lot of research has demonstrated that it's fine focusing on social emotional skills for children, but it's really hard for children to develop those skills if we don't have an environment that supports the building of those skills. And so that is another equity dimension that we looked at in South Sudan, and that we look at in all of our social emotional learning programming. And we ask children specific questions around their sense of safety and their sense of support in either their school or in a community learning center, depending on where we do the program. In South Sudan, it was in schools, and so we specifically asked questions about children feeling comfortable sharing their ideas, looking for someone for help, going to someone when they had a problem. And we saw fairly good increases. For example, at baseline, when we collected this data, pre-test, about 45% of children felt that people in their school help each other with problems. That number almost doubled by the end of grade 4. Similarly, children paying attention when other people were talking, which is a key skill that we work on during the program, that also almost doubled over the program period. And so we see this as a key equity dimension about targeting the environment to better build skills for children. And one way we've looked at those skills is through literacy. So we also had that literacy outcome. And what we saw was that over this year, we don't have a comparison or control group. This is not an impact evaluation. But all that caveat said, we did see some fairly dramatic improvements in terms of the literacy skills for children over just 1 year. At pre-test, when children were in grade 3, about 76% or 75% could not really read any of the grade 3 passage that we presented them. They really struggled with it. They could read a few letters, but couldn't really go much further. But by post-test, or the middle of grade 4, we saw that at least 1 out of every 3 children could read a grade 3 passage and answer some of those comprehension questions that we asked them. So over just a year, for just these 100 children, we saw a pretty dramatic move in terms of their literacy. And so part of this may be because of the well-being focus. Part of it could also be because the South Sudan team focused quite dramatically on literacy, doing a lot of community activities around literacy, like reading clubs and reading festivals and book banks. And so that might also affect it. And part of it might be building the social support network of children that allows them to build these skills over this period. And so kind of our takeaways from this pilot that we've started moving forward with since then was that these tools are kind of valid and reliable to be used in these settings. The teams gave us a lot of feedback around the feasibility and use of these tools that we've used to better improve these tools. Children are learning despite all of these disruptions that they're experiencing in these camps. And that even with a small sample, we see these marked changes or growth in these skills, both in social emotional learning and in literacy. And so if we focus on a bigger sample and do an impact evaluation, I think which we're heading towards, we would see a lot more growth and a lot more change and be able to tie in a lot of those mechanisms around equity to this growth for children. And that's it for me, so I'll hand it back to Julia.
Great, thanks, Nikit. So before we move into the questions, just to give a little bit more information about some of the work that ECCN's Equity Task Team is focusing on, because I think this is kind of a nice segue from what Nikit had just presented. So the Equity Task Team is really concerned with identifying critical barriers to equity in education, particularly among forcibly displaced communities. And this is based on the fact that we recognize these barriers can inhibit not only access to education, but also the quality of education services and the educational outcomes overall, which can impact, and possibly negatively, how much a child can succeed and thrive, particularly in conflict settings or fragile environments. So the task team has been working on identifying and sharing successful approaches to addressing barriers to education among these marginalized populations. And right now, the task team is working on a brief that will attempt to outline the various barriers to equity and useful approaches and best practices. The task team will also focus on accelerated education opportunities aimed at providing equity for those whose schooling has either been interrupted or delayed due to crisis or conflict. So if anyone is interested in these issues, feel free to contribute to the task team's work by reaching out to Sabine or Brenda Bell, who are the two chairs. So we can add, maybe right now, if we could add the email addresses into the chat box, that would be great. And as you can see, we've added ECCN's Equity Task Team link as well into the chat box. So if you're interested, please feel free to reach out to both of them to find out more about how you can get involved. And so if we move now to some of the questions that were written in the chat box during the session. So Yasmin, I think this first question is probably for you, but a question was, how important was it to do literacy training with parents who did not read to enable them to promote learning at home? So did you experience that at all, and could you speak to that quickly?
Okay, thank you, Julia. So as I said, we give the parents techniques on how to promote and encourage learning at home. But we found that the parents that could read and write can help their children more by encouraging them more and participating in the learning process with the children more than the parents that couldn't read and write. So we try to give the basic literacy skills for the parents, so they can help their children more. They can help them in studying in home, in addition to other techniques in promoting learning at home. So from our simple observation, it's more effective for the parents to be able to read and write or to have the literacy skills in addition to the techniques of promoting learning at home.
Okay, thank you. And then another question, and Yasmin, this probably is best for you to answer as well. So could you share any specific strategies for addressing the discriminatory practices that may exist in some of these schools? So how are we thinking about children with special needs, discrimination against children due to their ethnicity or their gender? And how are these practices changed or equity enhanced through this program?
Okay, so in this part, we at Save the Children International, we have some manuals that related to the resilience and the coexistence between Egyptian children and other children from different nationalities. So, for example, if I take the discrimination issue between Syrian children and Egyptian children, we are trying to work with the children themselves, the Egyptian children, and using different activities and methodologies with them. So, for example, the one that mentioned by Naked, the role play, or that we are trying to the situational model. We are trying to put the Egyptian children in the same story or in the same situation for the Syrian one or the African, and make them think about their feelings, how they feel right now, and how they can do to help other children that are in the same situation. So our approach is to work with the children themselves, because most of the discrimination issues from in the school came from the children themselves. And also we are working with the teachers themselves on the discrimination on two ways. The first way is to try to give them the bigger picture and to give them all aspects of the crisis and what the children passed by and all of this, and also with the central level in the Ministry of Education, so they can enforce the rules and enforce that the education are welcoming for all the children from all nationalities. Also, some of the teachers said that we couldn't afford to teach for all these numbers of the children, so we are trying to give them extra techniques on classroom management, for example, how they can manage a huge number. We are trying to create or establish extra learning spaces, and we are trying to develop extracurricular activities. All of these techniques help the teachers to manage his attitude with the children and manage the classroom, so he will not use any discriminatory action with the children. For the children with special needs, the social emotional learning actually gives some basics activities for the children with the the minor mental issues. So, for example, the children with behavior problems or the children with extra movement problems, there is some activities that it's a control activity. It's a kind of control activities that should be done with all the class, so they can control themselves. So it deals with the basic special needs children issues, um, but it gives the teachers, in fact, more tools and techniques in order to encourage other children to participate in the activities and to design the activities in a welcome and inclusive way in order to be welcoming for all the children.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that was a really thorough answer. And I do think this is something we're seeing where, providing children who may, especially children with some different learning needs, by teaching social emotional learning, we're giving them the opportunity to shine in the classroom in a way that is not so academic. And it is helping to make them feel empowered, which can lead to improvements in learning outcomes. So thanks very much for sharing that. The last question that we've received, I think, is for you, Nikit. So the question is, are you using any competency-aware monitoring approaches for this program? And if so, which ones? And is there any learning that you can share?
I love that question, because I think it's great that we've come to a place where we have this language around complexity-aware monitoring, which is specifically along with kind of a linear program or program indicators, also having things in place that will allow us to measure the unpredictable things that happen in a program, which is especially important in emergencies, but in all of our different programs. And so I think most of the methods around complexity-aware monitoring would be things like outcome harvesting, most significant change, process monitoring of impact, all of those different pieces that look at complexity. In this program itself, we didn't have a structured piece that was focused on complexity-aware monitoring. We did do a little bit of feedback from stakeholders that from both Egypt and South Sudan went into a broader workshop that we did in Nairobi to kind of figure out the feasibility and the kind of key mechanisms that interrupted change in the project. And in South Sudan, we did look at most significant change around one of the reading camps that they were having. And so we did follow up a little bit with that, but it wasn't as structured as we've started to build in now. So I think we learned a lot from the project around complexity-aware monitoring, even though we weren't using that language back then. And so I think now we're in a much better place to do it. I think the key piece is finding the resources and the space to be able to embed monitoring of unpredictable into this linear model of process evaluations and program indicators that we have. And so that's kind of the challenge we're facing with complexity-aware monitoring right now.
Thank you very much. So just to conclude, we want to thank everyone for joining, and I would also like to mention that the Equity Task Team has been working with the Education Equity Research Initiative who has been developing a guidance document on equity of access indicators. And so that will be shared during a webcast on November 14th to discuss this topic a bit further. So for those of you that are interested, please just keep your eyes open for announcements coming about that webcast. And we encourage everyone to attend and to RSVP. So thank you very much for your time, and we hope that everyone has a great day and is thinking about how to increase more equitable learning outcomes in your programming.